In 2016, Rob Reiner went to court. He sued over This Is Spinal Tap, the film that defined his career and helped reshape modern comedy. The filing drew a hard line that could not be erased. The man who turned satire into a cultural landmark said that decades later, the financial trail behind his own creation no longer made sense. How does a director lose control of the very film that made him untouchable? If you follow stories where Hollywood legends collide with systems built to outlast them, consider subscribing. This is not a story about jokes or cult fame. It is about the moment Rob Reiner realized his legacy was no longer his to protect. Before the lawsuit, before the accounting disputes, Rob Reiner was already a fixture of American culture. He did not arrive as an outsider crashing Hollywood's gates. He was born into it, raised around it, and expected to understand its rules long before he challenged them. The son of Carl Reiner, Rob Reiner grew up in a world where comedy was both craft and currency. Laughter paid bills, timing mattered, and control even then belonged to whoever owned the room. Reiner first became famous not behind the camera, but in front of it. As meathead on All in the Family, he embodied a generational conflict playing out in living rooms across America. The role made him recognizable, bankable, and publicly defined, but it also taught him something quieter and more dangerous. Being the face of a success did not mean being the one who steered it. Visibility and authority were not the same thing. By the late 1970s, Reiner was determined to cross that line. Directing was not a lateral move. It was a bid for authorship. When he stepped behind the camera, he did so with an instinct shaped by television's writers' rooms and by watching his father navigate an industry that smiled warmly while keeping its contracts close. Reiner's early directing work was defined by precision and restraint. He trusted structure. He believed that if the work was good enough, the system would eventually reflect that value back to its creators. This Is Spinal Tap shattered that assumption in two directions at once. On the surface, it looked like a small, clever satire. Underneath, it became something far larger, a cultural artifact that refused to age out. The film grew without him pushing it, selling long after its theatrical life ended, quoted by generations who were not alive when it premiered. It turned Reiner into a director whose name was inseparable from a specific kind of intelligence and bite. And yet, as the years passed, something did not align. The public saw a man permanently attached to a legendary film. The private reality, according to Reiner, was a paper trail that told a very different story. Statements arrived. Explanations were offered. Silence filled the gaps. What should have been a settled legacy remained unsettled. This story matters not because Rob Reiner was successful, but because he was established. He knew the industry. He spoke its language. And still, decades later, he would claim that the value of his own work had slipped into a system designed to outlast memory. That contradiction is where this story begins to turn. The project that would later become a cultural landmark did not begin as a safe bet. It began as a risk disguised as a joke. The idea was simple on paper and dangerous in practice. Treat a fictional rock band as if it were real, follow them with the seriousness of a documentary, and never signal to the audience where the satire ended. At the time, that approach had no proven commercial formula. The industry understood parody. It did not yet understand commitment to the illusion. For Rob Reiner, this was not a casual experiment. It was a deliberate move to test whether authorship could be asserted without spectacle. He placed himself on screen not as a star, but as a mediator, a filmmaker inside the film, guiding the audience through a world that refused to break character. The choice was strategic. By embedding himself within the story, he controlled tone, rhythm, and perspective. Nothing escaped the frame without passing through his judgment. The production itself reflected that philosophy. Much of the dialogue was shaped through improvisation, but the structure was rigid. Scenes were built to look accidental while being carefully engineered. This balance between freedom and control became the film's signature. It also became the reason the movie aged differently from its contemporaries. It did not rely on topical jokes. It relied on behavior, ego, silence, the uncomfortable pauses where truth leaks out because no one thinks it matters. When the film was released, the reaction was muted. It was not a blockbuster. It did not arrive with awards momentum or studio fanfare. Some audiences were unsure whether they were supposed to laugh. Others missed the joke entirely. From a traditional business perspective, it looked modest, even disappointing. There was no immediate indication that this project would define anything. Then something unusual happened. The film refused to disappear. Through late-night screenings, word of mouth, and repeat viewings, it began to grow sideways rather than upward. Viewers quoted lines. Musicians recognized themselves in the caricature. Younger audiences found it years later and assumed it was new. The movie became portable. It traveled without marketing. It survived without reinvention. Over time, it crossed a rare threshold. It stopped being a film and started being a reference point. For Reiner, this should have marked a moment of security. A director with a permanent place in the culture is supposed to gain leverage, not lose it. The industry rewards longevity, at least in theory. The credits roll, the contracts sit in drawers, and success compounds quietly. But the kind of success this film achieved did not follow clean lines. It did not peak and decline. It accumulated. Every new format, every revival of interest, every ancillary product extended its life. The movie was no longer confined to theaters or even to film. It existed in fragments, in music, in merchandise, in language itself. And that is where the first fracture appeared. A work that never stops circulating, never stops generating value. But value only returns to those who have legal pathways built to receive it. Over time, the gap between cultural presence and personal return became harder to ignore. The public narrative said the film was immortal. The private paperwork, according to Reiner, told a far less flattering story. At first, this discrepancy did not produce confrontation. Hollywood runs on patience and deference. Questions are asked quietly. Clarifications are requested. Explanations are accepted even when they do not fully satisfy. The system assumes compliance will outlast frustration. Years passed. The film continued to be rediscovered. Its reputation hardened into fact. New generations treated it as canon. Meanwhile, the sense that something fundamental was misaligned did not fade. It sharpened. This was not a story of sudden betrayal. It was a slow accumulation of unease, a realization that a project built on creative trust had entered a world governed by perpetual ownership structures. The film had become bigger than the moment it was made, but the agreements surrounding it had not evolved with its status. At some point, a question stops being rhetorical. When a filmmaker sees his work cited everywhere but its value reflected nowhere meaningful back to him, the issue is no longer about money alone. It becomes about authorship. About whether creating something that lasts means surrendering control to systems designed to endure longer than any individual. That tension did not explode immediately. It waited. It sat beneath decades of success, masked by laughter and reputation. But it was moving toward a moment where silence would no longer be the safer option. Because when a legend keeps growing, eventually someone has to ask who is actually holding the keys. What followed the film's slow rise was not celebration, but administration. Not applause, but paperwork. For Rob Reiner, the questions did not begin with outrage. They began with routine. Statements arrived. Numbers were presented. Explanations were offered in language that sounded complete while answering very little. Nothing appeared overtly hostile. That was the problem. The business surrounding This Is Spinal Tap had been constructed in layers, each one legal, each one insulated from the other. Film rights sat in one place. Music rights lived somewhere else. Merchandising occupied a separate lane entirely. Over time, additional entities entered the picture. Distributors changed hands, and accounting responsibilities moved from office to office. No single door opened to the whole house. In Hollywood, complexity is not an accident. It is a feature. Each layer creates plausible deniability. Each handoff stretches accountability thinner. When money flows through enough channels, the absence of it can always be explained by distance rather than intent. The system does not say no, it says not here. For a creator, this creates a peculiar paralysis. To challenge one part of the structure without understanding the rest is to risk looking uninformed. To challenge all of it at once is to declare war. The industry counts on that hesitation. It counts on the idea that reputations are fragile and that asking too many questions can quietly change how phones get answered. Reiner had spent decades inside this ecosystem. He understood how deals were framed, how back-end participation worked in theory, and how definitions could be narrowed without technically being false. Gross did not always mean gross. Net could be shaped until it barely existed. Expenses could multiply in ways that never appeared unreasonable on paper. What made this situation different was duration. This was not a single disappointing year or a temporary dip. The film's cultural life contradicted the financial narrative year after year. New formats emerged, interest resurfaced, references multiplied. Yet the statements remained stubbornly unimpressive. At some point, repetition stops being coincidence. The longer the pattern held, the more it suggested design rather than misfortune. And still, nothing in the system forced a reckoning. Silence was not enforced. It was rewarded. The rights maze also did something more subtle. It blurred responsibility. When accountability is diffused across enough entities, there is no villain to confront, only a structure to navigate. That structure speaks in neutral tones. It expresses regret without admission. It provides data without clarity. It invites patience, but patience has a cost. Time does not pause while paperwork circulates. Careers age. Energy narrows. The longer a dispute remains abstract, the less likely it is to be resolved on equal footing. Systems know this. They are built to outlast individuals. For Reiner, the issue was no longer whether the system was functioning as designed. It was whether continuing to operate inside it without challenge amounted to consent. Each year of acceptance reinforced the precedent. Each unanswered question became part of the record. The maze did not collapse on its own. It never does. It waited for someone to decide that understanding it was no longer enough. That moving carefully through it had achieved nothing except delay. The moment that matters in stories like this is rarely loud. It is the quiet decision to stop asking for clarification and start demanding accountability. To move from private confusion to public consequence. To accept that once a challenge is made, it cannot be softened or walked back. When that decision is taken, the maze does not disappear. It hardens. And the only way through it is no longer negotiation, but confrontation. That is when a dispute stops being administrative and becomes irreversible. The shift happened quietly, but once it happened, it could not be reversed. When Rob Reiner authorized legal action over This Is Spinal Tap, the story moved out of private correspondence and into public record. The moment the lawsuit was filed, negotiation ended. From that point forward, every statement, every document, every silence would be interpreted through an adversarial lens. There was no version of events in which this decision faded away. For decades, disputes over creative accounting had followed an unspoken code. They were handled discreetly, framed as misunderstandings, resolved behind closed doors if they were resolved at all. Public litigation was seen as extreme, even impolite. It signaled not only dissatisfaction, but refusal. A refusal to accept explanations that could not be reconciled with reality. A refusal to let time dilute the issue any further. By filing suit, Reiner did something that unsettled the industry more than the allegations themselves. He made the mechanics visible. The lawsuit did not accuse a single individual of malice. It pointed instead to a structure, a network of rights and accounting practices that allowed a work with undeniable cultural and commercial life to report returns that seemed detached from that reality. The accusation was systemic, not personal. That made it harder to dismiss. The response was immediate and predictable. Motions were filed. Jurisdiction was challenged. Definitions were scrutinized. The language of the dispute shifted from narrative to precision. Words that had once been used casually were now dissected. Profit participation, net receipts, distribution fees. Each term carried weight, and each interpretation could alter the entire outcome. This was no longer about whether the film was successful. That was beyond dispute. It was about whether success, as experienced by audiences, translated into value for those who created it. And if it did not, whether the fault lay in bad faith or in contracts designed to absorb value before it ever reached the source. For Reiner, the consequences of crossing this line were not theoretical. Litigation has a way of freezing relationships in place. Studios become cautious. Collaborators hesitate. Every future deal is colored by reputation. The industry does not punish openly. It remembers quietly. Yet the alternative had become untenable. Accepting the existing narrative meant accepting that cultural impact and financial participation could exist in entirely separate worlds. It meant accepting that authorship ended when signatures were placed on documents whose long-term implications could not be fully known at the time. It meant allowing silence to finalize a version of history that did not align with lived experience. As the case progressed, the scope widened. The dispute began to draw in additional parties connected to the film's distribution and exploitation. Each new layer added complexity, but also clarity. What initially appeared as a single accounting issue now revealed itself as an ecosystem, one that functioned efficiently precisely because responsibility was distributed. The legal process moved slowly, as it always does. Claims were challenged. Portions were dismissed. Others were allowed to proceed. To an outside observer, the back and forth could appear procedural, even dull. But beneath it ran a deeper current. Every ruling, however narrow, tested whether the system would be forced to explain itself in full. This stage of the story is often misunderstood. It is tempting to frame it as a simple battle between an artist and a corporation. That framing misses the point. The real conflict was between memory and documentation, between a public understanding of what a work was worth and a private ledger that told a different story. Courts do not adjudicate feelings. They adjudicate contracts, and contracts, once signed, carry a gravity that can outweigh even the most obvious contradictions. Still, something fundamental had shifted. The lawsuit created a record. It forced disclosures. It compelled responses that could no longer be delivered informally. Even if the case were to fail entirely, the act of filing had already altered the balance of power. Silence was no longer the default setting. For the industry, this was unsettling. Cult classics are supposed to be safe. They are the artifacts everyone claims to love and no one expects to interrogate. By challenging the financial reality behind one of the most beloved examples, Reiner disrupted a comfortable illusion. If this film could be subject to scrutiny, so could others. And that possibility made the case larger than the individuals involved. The point of no return is not defined by outcome. It is defined by commitment. Once a creator chooses to test the system in public, there is no clean exit. Win or lose, the relationship with the industry is permanently altered. The cost is not only measured in legal fees or settlements, but in identity. One becomes not just a filmmaker, but a litigant. Not just a storyteller, but a challenger. As the case moved forward, the question ceased to be whether the system would bend. The question became what it would cost to force it to respond at all, and whether the price of confrontation was lower than the price of continued silence. That calculation, once made, cannot be unmade. The lawsuit was filed. The record was opened, and whatever the outcome, the story had crossed into territory where reputations, not just revenues, were at stake. Once the case entered the public arena, the aftershocks spread beyond the courtroom. What had been a private dispute over statements and definitions became a signal event inside the industry. For Rob Reiner, the consequences were immediate but understated, the kind Hollywood prefers. No open condemnations, no dramatic blacklists. Instead, a recalibration. Conversations grew cautious. Language tightened. Familiar assurances were replaced with legal phrasing and delays. The press coverage framed the story cautiously, often reducing it to numbers and procedural updates. That framing obscured the deeper effect. Lawsuits like this are not only about outcomes, they are about precedent. By pushing the dispute forward, Reiner forced an uncomfortable question into circulation. If a filmmaker so closely identified with a beloved cult classic could claim the financial reality made no sense, what did that imply for less protected creators? The response from the opposing side followed a familiar pattern. Motions challenged scope. Responsibility was narrowed. Each counter-argument emphasized contractual intent and historical compliance. Nothing on paper suggested misconduct. Everything suggested a system operating exactly as designed. That was the point. If the system functioned legally, then the burden shifted back to the creator to prove that legality itself had produced an unreasonable result. As months turned into years, the emotional rhythm of the case changed. Initial outrage gave way to endurance. Litigation is not sustained by anger. It is sustained by resolve. The slow pace tested whether the challenge would lose momentum. Procedural wins and losses arrived in small increments, rarely decisive on their own. To the outside world, it looked static. Inside, pressure accumulated. For Reiner, the fallout was not only professional, it was narrative. His identity had long been anchored to creative achievement. Now it included confrontation. Interviews inevitably circled back to the dispute. Questions about legacy were no longer abstract. They were tied to documents, filings, and the possibility that a defining work might remain financially opaque forever. The industry's counters were subtle but effective. Emphasize complexity. Highlight duration. Point to compliance. The message was consistent. This was not a story of wrongdoing, but of misunderstanding. And misunderstandings, the implication went, do not warrant public escalation. That framing attempted to return the dispute to a technical disagreement, stripping it of moral urgency. Yet the longer the case persisted, the harder that framing became to maintain. Each procedural step reinforced the fact that the issue had not resolved itself over decades. Silence had not corrected the imbalance. Time had not clarified the record. If anything, it had entrenched it. Behind the scenes, the litigation forced disclosures that rarely surface. Agreements written for a different era were examined under contemporary expectations. Assumptions about how value should flow were challenged by evidence of how it actually moved. The case did not accuse the industry of cruelty. It accused it of indifference to outcomes once paperwork was complete. Public reaction followed a familiar arc. Initial curiosity faded into sporadic attention, punctuated by occasional headlines when the case shifted. But among creators, the story traveled differently. It became a cautionary reference, a reminder that longevity did not guarantee clarity, and that success did not automatically secure fairness. This phase of the story is where many disputes quietly end. Fatigue sets in, costs rise. Settlements are discussed not as vindication, but as relief. The question becomes less about being right and more about whether continuing is worth the erosion of time and energy. Systems rely on this calculus. They do not need to defeat challengers outright. They only need to outlast them. What kept this case alive was not spectacle, but persistence. The willingness to accept that even an imperfect resolution could alter future behavior. That forcing visibility, even temporarily, could have effects beyond the immediate parties involved. The lawsuit had already changed the conversation. That alone mattered. By the time the dispute approached its later stages, the stakes had shifted again. It was no longer about correcting past statements. It was about defining what closure would look like in a system that rarely offers it cleanly. Whether a negotiated end would feel like compromise or capitulation depended on perspective. What remained constant was the underlying contradiction. A film that continued to live vibrantly in the culture had spent decades trapped in financial ambiguity. The fallout revealed how easily those two realities could coexist without resolution, and it set the stage for a final question that no ruling could fully answer. If a creator confronts the system and forces it to respond, what does victory actually mean? The ending did not arrive with a verdict read aloud in a packed courtroom. It arrived the way most Hollywood disputes do, through negotiation, compromise, and language designed to close a chapter without rewriting the past. For Rob Reiner, this was the final turn of a story that had already exacted its toll. The system he challenged did not collapse. It adjusted. Settlements are often mistaken for admissions. They are not. They are agreements to stop. They acknowledge risk, not fault. In cases like this, they also acknowledge something else: endurance. The longer a dispute lasts, the more valuable resolution becomes to all parties, regardless of who believes they are right. Closure becomes a currency of its own. By the time the dispute reached its concluding phase, the central question had shifted. It was no longer whether the financial trail behind This Spinal Tap perfectly reflected its cultural impact. Courts are ill-suited to measure that. The question was whether continuing to press the issue would produce more truth, or simply more delay. At some point, the act of confronting the system had achieved what it could. What a settlement offered was not vindication, but definition. It drew a line under decades of ambiguity and replaced it with terms that could be lived with, even if they could not erase what came before. For the industry, it avoided a precedent that might invite broader scrutiny. For Reiner, it provided an end to a fight that had already served its larger purpose. That purpose was never purely financial. Money was the mechanism, not the motive. The deeper issue had been authorship. Who retains moral ownership of a work once legal ownership fragments? By forcing the dispute into the open, Reiner had demonstrated that silence was not the only option available to established creators. Even if the system remained intact, it could be compelled to respond. There's a quiet cost to reaching this kind of ending. Settlements do not offer the clarity of a judgment. They do not rewrite narratives or confirm suspicions. They simply stop the clock. For some, that feels unsatisfying. For others, it is relief. In this case, it marked the moment when confrontation gave way to acceptance, not of the system as just, but of its limits. The film itself continued on, untouched by the dispute. Quotes remained in circulation. New audiences discovered it without knowing anything about the contracts behind it. That separation between cultural life and legal reality persisted. Perhaps it always will. What changed was that the gap had been named. For Rob Reiner, the end of the case did not redefine his career. It clarified it. He was no longer just the director associated with a legendary satire. He was also a figure who had tested the boundaries of an industry built on longevity and silence. He had learned, publicly, that legacy is not secured by applause alone. The story does not conclude with triumph or defeat. It concludes with recognition. Recognition that in Hollywood, ownership is not a feeling. It is a structure. And structures do not bend unless pressure is applied long enough to be felt. What this story ultimately exposes is not a loophole, but a pattern. Rob Reiner did not stumble into Hollywood unaware of its mechanics. He grew up inside them. He succeeded within them. And still, decades later, He found himself confronting a system where cultural permanence did not guarantee clarity or control. The contradiction was not accidental. It was structural. The dispute over This Is Spinal Tap did not end with a public reckoning or a rewritten history. It ended with an agreement to stop pressing forward. That outcome may feel anticlimactic, but it is also revealing. In an industry built to endure longer than the people who create within it, resolution is rarely about truth. It is about limits. How long a challenge can be sustained. How much pressure a system is willing to absorb before it adjusts just enough to remain intact. Reiner's decision to confront that system mattered precisely because it came so late in a successful career. It challenged the assumption that time smooths everything out. In this case, time preserved the problem. Silence did not protect legacy. It obscured it. And breaking that silence carried a cost that only someone with an established name could afford to pay. This is not a cautionary tale about contracts alone. It is a reminder that authorship does not end when the work succeeds. It becomes more vulnerable. The louder the applause, the quieter the paperwork can become. And without scrutiny, the distance between what the world celebrates and what creators retain can grow without limit. So the final question lingers. When a work outlives its maker's control, who is its legacy really serving? If stories like this help you see the hidden structures behind famous names, take a moment to like the video, share it, and subscribe for more deep dives into Hollywood's quiet power struggles.